Hi, today is Wednesday of the 23rd week of Ordinary Time, and we continue with our reflections on the call to a discipleship of depth, according to the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus calls us, as he called the first disciples, to go deeper into understanding what our religion, what our Christian practice is all about. So as we know, when the Gospel writer writes, it's meant for a community of Christians already. So people who already believe in Christ, people who already practice a certain religiosity or Christianity, but they want to grow, to understand more deeply what being Christian is all about. So the Gospel writers have written for different audiences, different communities. And in the case of the Gospel of Luke, we have learned from Bible scholars that they have Luke had written for converts, Greek converts. So, for example, the Gospel of Matthew was written for Jewish converts. So they were already Hebrews. They knew the Old Testament. They were practicing as Jews, and they converted to Christianity. So there was a certain way that Matthew would write for them that would be meant for people who knew God as a people of Israel already. But as for the Gospel of Luke, it was for more recent Greek converts, so they had probably less idea of the Jewish Old Testament, of what all this was about, and Luke was writing for them in a way that they would understand the Gospel better. So normally you say this is the Gospel for the pagans, for those who are starting in their faith and want to know the basics of Christianity. So we continue following Christ according to Luke in this discipleship of depth. Now it's also important, I think, or helpful to remember that when we talk about depth, we're not talking about something difficult to understand. Sometimes we say something is deep, so it's either difficult to understand, it's too mysterious, or it's for a certain special group of people who are in the clouds and who are praying all the time, or they read a lot, or they know a lot about the Bible or the doctrine, etc. Well, that's not what we're talking about this time when we speak about depth. When we speak about a discipleship of depth, we are talking about understanding better who God is in our lives, in personalizing or making more interior and important, significant to ourselves, who God is and who we are for God, to understand what is the significance of my Christianity, of my response to God. How, when we talk about depth, it's about how we can understand what is my Christian response in daily life. So depth is not about knowing more. Depth is not about being more abstract or knowledgeable. Depth is about practicing more. It's about understanding how in my daily life I can put into practice, I can understand these teachings of Jesus, of who God is and who I am and what God really wants for me. So once again, depth is not about something complicated or difficult, so don't worry. We're just going to try to follow Jesus to understand more deeply what being Christian is all about according to Luke. So now, just a little recap also how we have started from chapter 4 and now we're already in chapter 6 and we're talking about the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount. But before going to that, we just a little recap, we were looking through how Jesus calls the disciples to go deeper, put out into deep water, and then after that there were the episodes of his healing, understanding what his mission was really about, healing, casting out demons, preaching the word of God. But at a certain point there was an encounter with the Pharisees, and here last week we were clarifying that the importance of having a deeper discipleship or understanding of Christianity is to know the place of rules, of the law. When we're talking about fasting, the Sabbath, that the important thing is God and the good of human beings. Remember, Jesus says the Sabbath is for man, not man for the Sabbath. And at the same time, he says that the Son of Man, Jesus, he himself, is the Lord of the Sabbath. So in other words, what is important when we talk about the commandments, the rules in church, the doctrine, even the moral life, is about placing God in the center, making Him the first priority, and also living for the good of our fellow men and women. So it's in function of human beings, of human well-being, not just in a material sense, but also in a spiritual and a holistic sense, no? How we can grow, and how Jesus comes to show us what it means to be human, perfectly human, and not escaping being human, but learning in human reality to find the significance of God. So Jesus tries to dispel all this about rules and all, making rules the first. He says, put God first, put prayer life first, put your interior growth first, and your relationships with others first, and then all the other rules, the Sabbath, fasting, etc., even going to church will have its place when we understand it in the context of loving God and loving our neighbor. So that was the first step that Jesus did for the disciples in bringing them to a deeper Christianity, to know the place of rules and the law and the norms of the church. Okay, so and when we get too caught up into whether people are doing things they're supposed to do in that sense, we might be going a bit off track. And to come back and going to the superficial level of our religiosity, and it's a call again to go back to the interior. So when we start judging people, for example, don't worry, it happens to all of us. When we start judging others instead of appreciating and loving them and loving God more in them, maybe it's a call to take a step back and understand why we're doing those things, and how we are actually growing in our interior lives. Okay, so now we come to the Beatitudes. Just a little note to say that the Beatitudes is really the core of discipleship. And when Jesus presents the Sermon on the Mount and he talks about the Beatitudes, he's like presenting the course outline, no, for discipleship. He's saying his Magna Carta, a manifesto of what following him is all about. So it's like an introduction, it's a launching of a deep discipleship. And there are two forms of the Beatitudes in the Bible. One version is in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, which is longer, which has 8 lines there to talk about what it means to follow Jesus. And of course, then the second version would be that of the Gospel of Luke. So both of them have their own wisdom and a certain version to address issues of their communities. That's why they're a bit different. But today, more than just going to these passages, I would like to, you can read it. It's Luke chapter 6, verse 20 to 26, for the Beatitudes according to Luke. But more than that, I'd just like to focus on something that the church tradition helps to summarize what the Beatitudes are all about. And we call it the Evangelical counsels. Now, Evangelical counsels basically are poverty, chastity, and obedience. 3 counsels that the church, in its long tradition, has taught us how to live the Beatitudes. So normally when we talk about the Evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience, we think about the religious, the religious life, those who are consecrated, the monks, the nuns, and etc. And it's true that they live these 3 vows, we call it, in a more radical way. But actually the Evangelical counsels are for all Christians, and it would be good for us to understand and reflect more on these 3 counsels in order to grow deeper in our Christian life. Why do I say that? Because the depth of Christian life is not so much in what we do externally, but it's more in how we imitate Christ more. So once again, discipleship of depth is about imitation of Christ, not the fulfillment of rules, as we said. The fulfillment of rules is just the introduction. knowing what are our obligations as Christians is just an introduction. And it will be a pity we just remain there because we are just like infants in our faith then. Now, in order to mature in our faith, in order to grow deeper, the evangelical counsels help us. What does it mean to be poor? When Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom." These are the real disciples who learn to live poverty. So how can we as Christians, ordinary Christians, live our poverty? Spiritual and material poverty. So materially, maybe we're not that poor, but at the same time, we can try to live in a simple way, a life of simplicity in the midst of maybe the abundance that we could experience. That could be a blessing from God as well. But spiritual poverty, humility, learning to accept our creaturehood, all these are different ways also that we can experience living poverty in our lives. And so this time could be a time for us to reflect, how can I live poverty? How can I live chastity? Chastity in the sense, as we go in the Gospel of Luke, is about being hungry. Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are hungry, they shall have their fill." So hunger is not just physical hunger. We know that chastity has to do with like a cure for gluttony, which has to do with hunger, a cure for lust. There's another kind of hunger, a cure for greed as well as another kind of hunger. So the church or the Christian communities from the beginning have advised us, if we want to really mature as Christians in following Christ, we need to understand the gift of moderation, of our needs to be satisfied, to be fulfilled by material things or the things of this world. Also a certain amount of detachment from that hunger or the desire to fill up that hunger. It could be also the affection of people. Sometimes we want to please people. We want people always to be happy with us. And when people are not pleased with us, we feel very restless or uncomfortable. So how can we also kind of like be detached a little bit from what people think about us? And I think that's quite a deep reflection about chastity. So chastity, of course, is about avoiding, the harmful things that can draw out our lustful desires more than it should be in that sense. But as well, it's not just about avoiding, this harmful contents in the internet and all that, but it's also about learning to have a balanced relationship with people, being able to tell them the truth when we need to tell them the truth because of love, because of what is right, and not be too caught by what they think about us. That is also chastity. Healthy relationships with people, learning to connect with people is also part of chastity, not just being isolated, having healthy friendships, that we can grow in, and committed social bonds as well. So that's the second level. No? So one is poverty. How can I live poverty more as a Christian? A life of simplicity, perhaps, in the things I have. And chastity, how can I develop more healthy social bonds, commitments as well, not just to my family, but social commitments that are healthy and balanced, and so that I can live free from the opinions of people as well, or being loved by people in that sense. And lastly, the vow of, or the counsel of obedience. Now, how can we live this obedience as Christians? And basically, I think obedience is about accepting life as it is from God and learning to seek His will. It says here, thirdly, blessed are those who mourn because they will laugh. So what is mourning? What is trying to accept sorrows of life, sufferings of life? There are things that will make us, sad, unhappy, or disturb us in our search for happiness. And the vow of obedience is about obeying life as it is, as creatures, accepting life as it is, accepting the challenges and difficulties that make life sad sometimes, but actively, not living as victims, but actively seeking the will of God. So obedience is first and foremost obedience to God's will. It's asking, Father, what do you want from me? God, what is your will, in this situation? Learning to act out of love, since we know that God is a God of love. So obedience is about seeking the will of love and carrying it out, living charity. Obedience to charity would be the first obedience that we need to live as Christians. So in summary, just briefly, what we're meditating today on this Wednesday of the 23rd week is about learning to follow Jesus more deeply by imitating Him, His way of life, not just by words or by rules, but imitating a way of living through the three evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And in summary, very briefly, poverty is about living a life of simplicity, of being detached from things, of luxury, of owning, of possessions, etc., and trying to live a simple life materially and spiritually as well. Chastity is about being detached from the opinions of people, or being too caught up by that. Of course, it's good to consider what people think, but not allowing that to be the main factor of our relationships. So healthy relationships that are balanced and healthily detached from what people think about us, so that we can be more authentic or live with more integrity. And thirdly, obedience, the counsel of obedience, is about seeking God's will, accepting life situations as they are each day, but seeking God's will and obedience to charity. How can we live with charity in the midst of life as we come, the things that we can't control? So let's try to ponder more deeply this gift of deepening in our discipleship of Christ through poverty, chastity, and obedience, trying to ponder, Lord, how can I live poverty in my life situations? How can I be more chaste in my dealings with other people, with myself, how I deal with myself, my body, my mind, and also with others? And how can I grow in obedience to the will of God, to the will of charity and love in my dealings with others?